Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion on crisis reportage with some of the finest photo editors from India and from the US. I would like to welcome MaryAnne Golon, Director of Photography, Washington Post. Hi, MaryAnne. I would like to also welcome Paroma Mukherjee, Head of the National Photography Desk, Hindustan Times. Hi, Paroma. And Tanvi Mishra, Creative Director of the Caravan magazine. Hi, Tanvi.
Hi.
Thank you all for agreeing to take out the time during these crazy busy times and to share your knowledge and insights with our audience. I'm going to open the discussion with a rather broad question on journalism, news, and the role of photography over time and various situations. I'd like to begin with this question that is news a matter of perspective? And has the perspective sort of taken over the basic tenets of journalism? Also, what is considered newsworthy? Given that newsrooms are also fighting a battle of numbers in terms of sales and readership, who is deciding what and how is being presented to the public? So just opening it up, MaryAnne, would you like to start with that?
Well, I feel like we're in obviously we're talking today during a pandemic, but if we set the pandemic aside, we're also in a very dangerous place in journalism right now, where there are world leaders all over the world, including the United States, where they're screaming fake news, fake news, fake news about everything. And it follows historical patterns of dictators and fascists, et cetera, that if you can silence the press and discredit the press, you can do whatever you want. And I feel that, we're the fourth estate, as we like to say all the time, and it's our responsibility as journalists, no matter what's going on, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's economic crisis, whether it's a hurricane, it doesn't matter what the news is, we need to inform. And I don't believe in the idea that everything is perspective. I believe that opinions are perspective. But I think if you cover journalism with training and with the proper and using the proper tenets that we've all been taught about how to tell a story, it's not a perspective story, it's a story about facts. And I think that truth has never been more important than it is in 2020, because there's so much, disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, et cetera, that I feel right now more than ever, the work that we're doing as journalists has never been more important.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that, MaryAnne. Paroma, Tanvi, one of you, would you like to say?
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with MaryAnne there. I think perspective is very important in journalism, but I think it also finds a place in the opinion pages. But facts are, absolutely key. That's what journalism is founded on. Facts from both sides of your argument of the story. Which then leads you to form an opinion and sort of zoom out and look at the larger picture of what is really happening, and it's usually sort of a matter of contention between the aggrieved and the person, the perpetrator. It might be individuals, it might be individuals against the state, it might be states against states, and it is a very trying time for journalism, even here in India. I think, especially for print journalism, because everybody knows that the pandemic has really hit the newspapers really badly, and even I think even Tanvi would agree, the magazines as well. Circulation is an all-time low. Pages are being shrunk. Edition pages are shrinking. There's the e-paper more in circulation, and that changes everything. That changes the whole sort of I think editorial direction that you might want to consider. I think there's been a very a very guided focus on what newspapers are going to now bring to the people. And it's very hard to condense a newspaper, cut down pages, and this is happening across. I don't think India is the only case; it's probably happening elsewhere as well. And now within that, to then entertainment takes a back seat, lifestyle culture takes a back seat, the pandemic reporting takes prime focus. So I think these are very trying times, but yeah, I think facts are the most important, and I don't think journalism is anything without facts and investigations. It's pretty much nothing without it.
Yeah, just to add on to what you both were saying, completely agree.
Okay.
In terms of, the sort of separation between commentary and reportage. And I don't know how much sort of in the public opinion right now, or sort of, mainstream conscience, that distinction is made, like what is opinion and what is fact, and to be able to distinguish between those two categories, which actually for journalists is like, they're completely like apples and oranges. But I think something that the pandemic has also done, and I don't know how different it is in the US, but here, yes, newspaper sales and magazine sales have been hit really badly, but I think something that we're seeing happening is like repression that's happening during the pandemic. I mean, one is to shut down the press, but also use the pandemic as an excuse to carry out a lot of other actions by the state that would otherwise be reported much more. But because COVID is like front page news, police brutality is going unreported. In India, protesters, like we saw protesters on the streets like never before. And the people who came out to protest, especially Muslims who came out to protest, are now being picked up from their homes. And it's not front page news. It's not even the headlines, because there are more pressing things that are going on, the migrant worker crisis. So you're actually like competing with like various human rights crises are competing with each other. And the sad part is that the pandemic and I know in Bangladesh also that this is happening, is being used as a mode of repression. And I think that's where, journalism has a huge role to play, to constantly, COVID is really important and you keep pushing out that news. And another thing that has also been happening is that the numbers revealed by the governments are not accurate. And there is an effort to keep those numbers low. And that's where the press becomes really critical, because you're sort of, supposed to be the voice for the people, not of the state. So kind of, I think COVID encapsulates where many, many countries have been heading for the last few years in terms of their polarized kind of nature.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to move on to another thought, adding to what Tanvi has also just mentioned, that it has been a seminal year, or rather the last few years, I would say, for press freedom, both in India and the US. And as MaryAnne was saying, the fourth estate or the press is not really a much loved entity, especially in today's times, definitely not a favorite of the governments, with many leaders discouraging any kind of thinking, questioning of the situations and the stories that are being put out there. Of course, branding it as negative or misleading coverage by the media. How do you navigate these pressures, and how does that impact the choice of the photographs or the stories that you're putting out there for the public to be consumed?
I mean, I can just begin that by saying that I think the press was never meant to be loved. And if you're loved by, well, if there are two sides to it, I mean, there's the public and there's the state. If you're loved by the state, then there's something very wrong with what you're doing. And even like in terms of like, I don't think it's about the feeling of pleasing anyone. The feeling of doing a service. And I think once you kind of see it through that lens, that this is a service for the people, and very often like for the people in terms of health, etc., but especially in terms of politics, to report the ills of any government. And once you kind of see it through that lens, it becomes very easy to pick the pictures, because to be able to kind of, say that, I think the thing there is then to distinguish between what is propaganda and what is not. And that's where I guess the photograph kind of can play both ways.
I completely agree that journalism is about service. The most treasured prize in journalism is the Public Service Award that's awarded by the Pulitzer Prize every year. And the idea is that as the fourth estate, what we're responsible for is reporting the news. We're supposed to find out the truth. There's, lots and lots and lots of reporting that goes on at the Washington Post that's the result of Freedom of Information Act here, FOIA claims, and spending years in courts fighting to get information so that you can tell the truth. And I think the issue is making people understand the difference between what is a public service and what is sensational. And so we were talking about a little bit about how the government, maybe the state in India, might be taking advantage during something like a pandemic, something like a typhoon, something like any kind of thing like this, provides like a smoke screen for members of maybe disingenuous politicians or disingenuous police forces or disingenuous humans to go out and do bad things. We've seen that with looting. We've seen that with all kinds of different things that happen when a terrible event happens, be it war or whatever it is. But back to the exact thing that we're talking about now. It's our responsibility as photography editors who are both assigning photographers and then working with their work and then representing that work to our editors to make sure that the images are accurate, that we've done the best we can to, for instance, we're not accepting that several government leaders in the United States are now saying, oh, we're only going to give you photographs from our personal photographers. So there are a lot of people trying to control access, photo access, etc. So that's the line in which you're looking at the difference between journalism and propaganda. Because if you're paying someone to take pictures to make them look good, and then we're publishing those pictures, that's a problem. So we have to push back really hard and say, okay, we understand with social distancing and small spaces for press events, et cetera, maybe we only have one person there, but we need it to be a journalist, not your paid photographer. That's one example. Another example is at the White House, where things are pooled all the time to keep fighting for the access that we need to be able to cover at the White House. And we have a staff photojournalist who has basically been at the White House every single day for this year, even since the pandemic. And now they're being tested every day. It's very invasive, being able to cover there. But again, as photography editors and people assigning and editing photojournalists, I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the images that we're representing are presented in a fair way and with factual information. I love to quote my boss, Marty Baron, who's the executive editor of the Washington Post. When all the fake news stuff started, his quote, which was taken out of an hour-long speech, but I still love this quote, is, "We are not at war. We are at work." And the idea is never been more important as a journalist to make sure you get it right the first time and that you absolutely stick by everything we know we're supposed to be doing. It's incumbent, especially now, that we are super, super careful.
Right. Paroma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, same here. It's access has been very hard, especially because everything's shut. And even, here we still, a lot of press briefings are now over video conferences. There's no question of a photographer being there in a lot of government offices, because most government offices are also shut in India. So we're actually having to make do with video grabs, and occasionally wherever we can, the parliament was open, but again there are barricades, so there's only up to a certain point that the photographer can go, and you can't enter beyond that. And it's a little different in India anyway, with respect to access to spaces that are sort of part of the government. But the other thing is how even within cities, because there's so much of COVID reporting now all the time, and even as a reader, I mean, you need some relief in the middle, and that's something I think all photographers and photo editors are also struggling with on a daily basis, because it's basically, the same kind of images every day. People getting tested in and out of hospitals, queues of people, of the homeless waiting to be fed. And all of these are pressing issues. So it's very hard to decide what really goes on page one or what's the recommendation you make. And then there's so much news that, at least in India, the visuals are sort of, I mean, the written news is slightly more important than the visual, at least in the mainstream Indian newspapers. Unless, of course, there's an exceptional image that tells it all. And there have been many during this crisis, especially. And I think we're using the online space really well, the website really, really well to, curate galleries and even repurpose wire images from across the world, and just, see how we can repurpose them to tell a story, not just put it out just like a gallery. Like, there's so much, I've barely seen anything coming out of Africa, anywhere in the mainstream, or even in, alternative
publications,
magazines, or even news websites. Nothing. I mean, and especially if you're sitting in India, you're not getting that feed at all. So we're trying to do that, at least in H2, a little bit, on and off, curate some galleries from other parts of the world, look at other communities, look at the LGBTQ community, how are they dealing with the pandemic, try to bring these stories out a little, and India is so huge, and there's it's been very hard with our photographers to, there's been a long dedicated sort of 2 months of conversations about how to get them out, giving them protective suits and masks and gloves, and constantly checking on photographers across. Even we had a photographer who tested positive in Bombay. And then the office was shut for 3 days. It was sanitized, and once it was in the clear by the local authorities, we were back at work again. So really hard decisions, and very important to choose an image that stays as neutral to the story as possible, that is pushing no one side, but it's pushing the right side, if you know what I mean.
So we'll come back to the question of being neutral, as far as photographs are concerned. I'd like to move the conversation forward now to maybe some examples that each one of you could probably take us through, of not just necessarily of Corona and the situation, the COVID situation, but that too, maybe if you have something. But it could be about, for example, I do remember that Caravan very actively covered the CAA and NRC, issue, and also the issues that are going on in Kashmir for a while now. Washington Post, of course, has been doing a lot of coverage of the pandemic and everything recently, and so has Hindustan Times. So maybe, Tanvi, do you want to start maybe by showing us some examples?
I have some examples. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. We did I don't know how much of, for MaryAnne as well, I'd just like to premise that we're actually, we're a magazine, we're a monthly magazine, we're not a newspaper. So obviously our team is extremely different. Also in terms of, so it's about a 35, 36 member team that takes out a monthly magazine. And then we're also an online web portal. So we take out stories every day. So of course, and the critical thing for us is we don't have a single staff photographer. So it's essentially an assistant photo editor. I double up. I actually come from a photo editing background, so photo editor and creative director, and then we have a 2-member multimedia production team, which is basically we're churning out our visual reporting. So we commission photographers from time to time, but very different setup. I think something that I can actually just kind of start with is, so there sort of, this is a loose selection of images, which I think I mean, I had actually kept them depending on like what comes up in the conversation. But for me, something that was very important for us in the newsroom recently was the targeted violence against Muslims that took place in Delhi at the end of February for 3 days. And I think that really shook us in the newsroom because, you know, suddenly how I actually found out about it, that a photographer that I followed on Instagram put up a photograph of him in the metro looking. I mean, it was a image from a moving metro looking at like smoke billowing out of buildings. And, you know, the caption kind of read Chandbagh burning. And then from then on, we saw for the next 3 days, there was targeted violence going on against Muslims in a particular part of the city. And for us, it was a call to take the, do we send a photographer in? Do I assign somebody to go in? Knowing fully well, I don't have the bandwidth, the institutional bandwidth to provide them the security or to be able to evacuate them from there. If anything happens, I don't think institutionally we can really do anything. And so we kind of received a lot of calls from photographers, and I made calls, and many of them kind of took the wise decision to not go in on the first day, because this was a very critical point in, I think, recent Indian history, that the police was a part of the violence. So if something happens, what are you going to do? So a lot of our coverage, visual coverage, was actually in the aftermath. And by the third day, photographers started going in, they started figuring out that, okay, they were allowed into certain lanes. And so this is an image from our assistant photo editor, who doubles up as a staff photographer, doubles up as a staff videographer very often. This is a torched mosque. They torched a lot of mosques in Delhi, and we're a long form magazine, so a lot of our coverage is premised on long form text. But to be able to, you know, see a mosque in this kind of shape was very important for us. But something that I think we did over a period of time, which is what we do in the magazine a lot, is long form photo reportage, and trying to weave a narrative through essentially news pictures. And usually I'm working with long-term bodies of work. So, you know, you have a lot more leeway to carve out a narrative. Here, you're basically carving out a narrative from about 3 or 4, well, this stretched on for about 3 weeks of reporting. So Ishan Tankha, a very good photojournalist, he has been shooting the anti-CAA protests for a while. And he started going in the third day onwards. And we started publishing single images from him to go along with text stories. And then by the 4th or 5th day, I realized, okay, there is some material here. We need to be able to show some of this. And, you know, for me, something like this is very important. This is a print layout. And actually, the magazine never went to print because of COVID, but we're hoping that it does. We might print old issues. But for me, a spread like this is really important because all the buildings kind of looked alike. They were all torched. There were streets that were strewn with bricks. So it wasn't more than the detail of the individual spaces. It was actually the policemen on the left, that the apathy in their body language and looking over the torched houses, etc. Of course, there are individual captions which give you the details. But so this is kind of what we do. We try to carve out a narrative, and some of this is basically people leaving their homes, along with the police enforcing section 144, which is not more than 4 people collecting in a space. And so a lot of our work has been in the aftermath. So Ishan went in for about 3 weeks and documented the spaces, and a spread like this is actually, when I saw these images, I was like, is this Kashmir? Because these are the kind of images that we've been seeing from Kashmir for years, and the public mourning. And this is now happening within the Muslim community in Delhi. So that's also where a lot of things came together for us visually. And I think I'll end with this one where at the end of the day for us, and these stories are hyper local, right? So much of the resonance lies on the writing on the wall and the writing on the wall that is left behind. While the reject NRC is something that the protesters were saying, the writing that is much more prominent on the wall is Islam, fuck you, and like against the Muslim community, and we want Hindu Desh, we want a Hindu country, and that becomes the prominent writing. And I think what I'll end on is what Ishan also said, that what it says in Hindi, MaryAnne, is Nasha Mukti, which basically means freedom from intoxication. And we were discussing how, I guess, it was a sign for, like, I guess, I don't know, an AA club or, freedom from alcohol or drugs. But, this is a different kind of intoxication of being sort of persecuting a minority in the country. So this is work from the recent violence in Delhi.
Thank you, Tanvi, for taking us through some of this work, and we hope that this also gets published and as in printed pretty soon. MaryAnne, would you like to share some different kinds of reportage that happens at the Washington Post and take us through your decision-making process
Sure.
in the time of various situations?
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So this was, we were very lucky in that, just to give you perspective, the Post photo department is very small in comparison to the newsroom. The entire newsroom, that's everybody, including, technical staff, all kinds of different kinds of staff, not just reporters and photographers, is about 1,200 people. And we're publishing online at the Washington Post 250 to 400 pieces of content per day online. And then we publish a print newspaper every day. And this work that I'm showing here came from an Italian photographer who went to one of the hardest hit areas. This was about dying at home, choosing to die at home from COVID instead of going to the hospital where you couldn't be near any of your loved ones. So this work is, this is the daughter wearing the mask, showing some of her father's things. And this was shot by Gianluca Pinella. And he went to this region and ended up finding this family. And our reporter, Chico Harlan, then interviewed the family based on Gianluca's work. He had already shot the photographs, and we actually bought the reportage from him rather than commissioning the work. Our policy has been that if you're required as a journalist to suit up in full PPE with masks, etc., that we can only cover staff photojournalists because the Washington Post has healthcare to protect them, but we don't have the resources to cover full PPE for all the freelance photographers that we work with. So in terms of perspective, sorry, I should be showing you photos. This is Gianluca's report from this region. And this family decided, this is the father in old times and with his family. And they decided to stay at home because they thought it would be better for him to be at home, never expecting that he would become so ill and actually die at home. That's the grandfather's actually expired on the floor in this photograph. But Gianluca, the family really wanted people to see that they had taken this choice. Instead of taking their 90-year-old father to the hospital, they kept him at home. So it was like one of the early stories that we published. This is an online presentation. And then I wanted to show you, this is a story in the United States about a mother who's separated from her children because obviously families here, well, I should say obviously, but in the United States, lots of families are spread out. It's a big country like India where people are in different places. So she's in Portland, and that's a portrait through the window of her apartment. This is commissioned. And she's texting with her children. Like, I'm so scared. We took a combination of screens from their text messaging. We went and photographed the mom. And she thought she was most at risk. And then her adult son in Utah came down with the virus. And they're separated, Utah and Portland, Oregon. And she can't be with her son. So this was her showing pictures of the family. I just thought this was really interesting to look at all, there she is in Portland on her balcony. These were shot by Mason Chinka on assignment for us. And then we had a second photographer, Jen Ackerman. These are her photographs with the daughter, and they're just waiting in their isolation to try to figure out what to do. They can't do anything for their brother / son. But anyway, there's no sad or happy ending here. He's still alive and he's still in treatment. But it wasn't at all what they expected it was going to be. You know, they expected that they should be really scared for their mom, and it ends up that one of the children comes down with the virus. Then I wanted to show you this, which I was thinking particularly of Tanvi when you were talking about, I have a background in magazine journalism, but journalism magazine. I worked at Time magazine for more than 20 years. And this piece was done by 3 of our photo editors, where we decided to look at how people were managing in isolation, either with or without their beloveds. So this one, we called it Love in the Time of Coronavirus. And we approached these different artists. It's love and loneliness. So this couple is separated and they're talking to each other on their phone. And the photographs are very artistic. This is Lucille Boiron, and that's her on the left. And the artists did these portraits themselves and talked about what it was like to not be with their beloveds. And this presentation I particularly love because it's a custom digital presentation that one of our most talented designers put together. But you can see how you can evoke loneliness and a feeling of isolation by the choice of photographers. You know, it's just, there's some sense of loss and loneliness in the photograph. So I'll go through this. We did it in 2 parts. So this was the first part, and this is the second, which was done in Tokyo. So we chose artists all around the globe to show what it felt like to be in isolation. This is, I'm sorry, the next one is Brazil, Luisa Dor, and she's with her family in isolation. But what I loved about this was the international sort of going to all these different places in the world and seeing that we're all dealing with this in the same way. You know, I mean, it's different for all of us depending on where you live and whether you have children or you don't have children, whether you're with your lover, you're not with your lover. I mean, the whole idea is that we're all dealing with the exact same issues about how do we move forward. And then these last pictures is a woman pregnant with her first child in Chicago and what it feels like to be giving birth during potentially giving birth during a pandemic. I mean, what does it mean? And is it scary? And you don't want to go to the hospital. And, you know, there's a lot of different, that's the couple together. Anyway, I love this stuff. Then I was going to show you just a couple more things. This is Hurricane Dorian. This is a completely different presentation. But this was Carolyn Van Houten and Zoanne Murphy and Ann Gerhardt put this together along with our photo editor, Nick Kirkpatrick, and Carly Dom Sadoff. And this is a presentation that was built for the phone. So it over here, when I click on the right, you would just swipe to look at it. So it's a mobile first presentation, but of course it's quite beautiful on the desktop. You can include video, you can include still photographs. This is a shot from a helicopter. And this is all in the hardest hit area of the Bahamas. And this was very scary because once we got our photographer, videographer, and reporter on the ground there, just talking about the dangers, they were stuck. We couldn't get them back. They closed the helicopter pads and we couldn't get over there to get them. So they literally spent the night exposed. You know, they found a building where they could be out of the elements, you know, but it was kind of scary because then we were able to go back and get them in the morning. But all these people were in that circumstance. It really helped the reporting in a way, because they could talk about, okay, we're just flying in here to show you what's happening, but then we're living it. You know, we have no water, we have no food, there's no lights, there's no, you know, and all these people were on the island. So I just think it's super interesting to look at the different ways you can present, but this is digital presentation, and the still photographs are all by Caroline Van Houten, who's a staff photojournalist for the Post. And then I wanted to show you this, but this was our last year's Pulitzer winner, and it's in the same format. And this is Lorenzo Tognoli, and he's our only contract photographer. We have 17 staff photographers that are based out of Washington, but Lorenzo lives in Beirut, and he won the Pulitzer Prize with this stunning coverage of Yemen. He did all of the coverage in 2018 and won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for showing the conditions in Yemen. And the interesting part is, I wanted to speak to that too, is about relationships in photography. We started working with Lorenzo my first year at the Washington Post, which was 2012. So we've been working with him now for 8 years. And he was a really young photographer and met one of our reporters in Kabul. He had put himself in Kabul for a while. So we started working with him when he was in Kabul. He ended up coming to the States and enrolling in the Eddie Adams Workshop, which is a sort of a famous photography workshop for students in the States.
Yes.
And I'm on the board of that workshop.
Right.
But we ended up spending a lot of time together, and this relationship developed over, you know, many years period. It was interesting for me to be explaining to my own newsroom, because they don't understand when it's a non-staff project. Wow, we have this non-staff project that won a Pulitzer Prize. And I'm saying, we've been working with this photographer for 8 years. You know, it's like, it's a long relationship. And I really feel, Tanvi, too, when you talk about the need for narrative. You know, when we're building these things, we move everything around over and over again to kind of tell a story. And the very last one I was going to show you, this is an Insight post, was of Jabin Botsford, a staff photographer. And this is a more traditional presentation because it's older, but it shows his coverage, his rather extraordinary coverage of Trump's rise to the presidency. Oh, here where he's holding his hands like that, he's walking on ice. They've put a carpet on ice, you know, but he managed, despite being in a pack of a lot of photographers, to make such unusual and beautiful images that he's really in close. He's very creative. I love this protest area. This is where you can stand if you want to protest.
Wow.
But I thought his work was election night. Anyway, I just wanted to show that, because that's the handover.
Right.
This is the photography that is our main bread and butter, is the coverage of politics. And last thing I'd say, I'm dying to see Paroma's work too, is how difficult it's been to cover Capitol Hill and the White House and everything here, because they do have to wear masks and gloves, and they have to be tested and all these things, and how scary it is in a lot of ways to be out there doing this coverage. But they've all been very brave. We're very proud of our team.
I like how you showed this older example as part of crisis reportage, but thanks for that. Well, over to you, Paroma. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually probably just show you the galleries and maybe some spreadsheets that we have. Let me try and do this. So let me So let's maybe chronologically. Yeah. So Shaheen Bagh was this iconic protest site. I mean, you probably, I mean, just for you, MaryAnne, and maybe for all the people who don't know, against about the anti-CA and NRC protests in Delhi, and where all the women of this area, predominantly sort of Muslim locality in Delhi, all the women came out on the road and they occupied a public road, a public highway, as a mark of protest, peaceful protest in Delhi, and this went on for over 100 days. And what happened eventually is, because of the pandemic and the lockdown, they had to be sort of taken off. The protest site had to be sort of dismantled, and it had become this incredible geography of public art and speeches, and very inspiring and all peaceful, very democratic, completely constitutional, no violence. So what we, I mean, and our photographers had been shooting there for months and months, starting December, January, and by the time the lockdown happened, I mean, and in a newspaper, it's crazy because we're dealing with like thousands of images every day, and because Hindustan Times has sort of bureaus all over India, so it's mad. By about 8 p.m., I'm dealing with 1,500 images just from our photographers that we have to then edit down for different editions. So I thought it would be, maybe to look at, because we hadn't really planned it ahead, to see how Shaheen Bagh would look now as opposed to what it did when it was thriving as a protest site. And that's how it sort of became, embedded in public memory almost, at least for people in Delhi. And it also became this very inspirational movement for a lot of other protests in India as well, against the law. So this is, so India Gate is this like iconic sort of monument in Delhi, and the artists in Shaheen Bagh constructed this little India Gate installation, which you can see on screen. And this is how the road looks empty after it was emptied out entirely. And this is how it was before, when there was no social. I mean, I tried to, sort of juxtapose images from similar angles as much as I could find, because we hadn't really shot it originally that way, thinking that one day it would not be there. This is again, the municipal corporation workers cleaning it up. This has again become a very important road. This is how it was on Republic Day.
Wow.
Republic Day, yes.
Again, another portion of the road, and this is how it was. This was the main tent where the women were sitting inside, and and people, the general public, there'd be crowds in upwards of 3,000, 4,000 every day, attending the protest in solidarity. This was a bus stop where the cops were resting after the protest was cleared out. And you can see all this graffiti on top, and this is how it is.
Depending on the wall happens, yeah. And
again, this was a foot-over bridge, and the authorities were painting over the graffiti once the lockdown came to place, so sanitizing the whole place. And this is how it looked back then. And again, this is the tent, and the women had put up posters saying no sneezing, fever-affected people don't show up. And this is how it was. This was the light-hearted sort of Valentine's Day protest for the state, saying that we'll give you love, just take the law back. So this is something we've done, and with the whole migrant workers walking back home in India, it's been quite heartbreaking actually, personally, also to see the images every day. And because we're seeing hordes and hordes of long shots of images, we thought we don't really know what each of the migrant workers look like. Where do they come from, where are they going? So we decided to profile 8 to 10 of them in Delhi so one photographer was commissioned, and we told him to just do portraits. And it's a very pressing time for even the photographers, because it's not like they have time to do just one story. They're busy with so many assignments in a day. So again, this is a 30-year-old man walking from one state, from Delhi to Ranchi. And 2 rupees, he was carrying 2 rupees on him. That's, I don't know, like, I can't even explain in relation to the dollar. That's 1/35th of a dollar. Wow. That's all he had on him. And this is what scenes from Delhi look like once the lockdown was imposed, and all these are basically workers in the unorganized sector in India. Lakhs and lakhs of workers walking back to their villages, walking 200, 300 kilometers walk without any transport, any infrastructure. 10-year-old boy. Again, this is an 18-year-old man. He was traveling with his mother and 2 younger sisters and carrying only 20 rupees. That's 1/3 of a dollar, 1/4 of a dollar nearly, actually. Security guard. So, and this is what it looked like when they, one of the states decided to offer some buses to carry the migrants home. This is in the middle of a pandemic. How do you socially distance? It was insane. So this is, I mean, essentially again city reporting, but I think it sort of works nationally because this is what scenes look like. Also, it was just nice to see some of them up front because there's this huge fear of just only looking at crowd shots and really not feeling anything after a point. So yeah, this is and then this is again kind of a fun city feature. Again, only Delhi specific. This is how Delhi looked before the lockdown, and we decided to shoot the same things post lockdown. And this is Connaught Place in Delhi, entirely empty. This is Nehru Place. This is a huge electronics market in Delhi, empty after lockdown. This is Janpath. This is a very popular flea market for clothes and all kinds of things in Delhi, in central Delhi. And it was unbelievable. This shot, I couldn't believe. I've never seen Janpath like this. So
neither have I.
Yeah. So again, Paharganj, which is a very popular sort of spot for foreign tourists on budgets and hippies, as they call them. This is post-lockdown. So sort of unbelievable what emptiness does to a city. And again, Sadar Bazaar in Old Delhi. This is an Old Delhi spice and sort of commodity market, and unbelievable
wholesale markets.
Market,
yeah.
So some stuff like this, and even through the riots coverage, actually, we did several galleries. Again, as I mean, Tanvi's shown there as well. So I don't want to do a repeat of images, but we were very keen to because images are it's so easy to form perceptions, biases looking at images, and especially when certain communities are, there are visible markers of how to recognize them. So very, very careful, at least in the print edition, about not carrying something that, immediately makes you feel biased because you read a story that might be, might have two sides to it, a government side, a community side. But if the image is something that makes you shift your opinion in a bad way, and that's something that we've been very, very careful of, definitely in the print edition at least, because that's what I oversee. We have a separate digital unit, and the galleries I handle. But so I think photography is, and it's been very pressing. Actually, it's been a very hard year for India, I think, right through the elections and the protests and the violence in the universities and the Delhi elections and the state elections and now the pandemic. And I think it's been an incredibly tiring time for our photographers.
Right.
With no weekly offs and overworked. And so, I mean, I just feel like at the end of the day, somehow I'm just the medium, I mean, all credit goes to people on the ground, really.
I did have a few more questions, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to maybe pick up some questions that have come in from the audience. We'll address those, and if there's time, I'll come back to my question. How do WhatsApp forwards, screenshots, found images, Instagram or social media source citizen photos or videos, sometimes without sources or credits, fit into your goal of telling the most authentic story, sometimes in the absence of a professional photographer? Would you like to maybe take that, Paroma? And then I'll...
So, I mean, at HT, we have a dedicated national photo desk, and which is essentially a filter. It's what a copy desk does for text. We do that for photos. So I mean, I have a complete, absolute no acceptance policy for unverified images, be it Instagram, even if it's viral. WhatsApp, absolutely not, because it's very, very hard to, and on a daily basis, to ascertain the, the validity, or, if this is really true, fact check. I mean, you get a forward from somewhere, so 1.3 billion people in the country. There's no, very hard to really. So we don't publish things from WhatsApp or Instagram or Twitter unless it has been verified to me personally on email from the person who's submitting. Of course, there are social media teams, there are people sharing news. It's very hard to control. I mean, something like that happened to one of my images actually at a protest. It just went viral overnight.
Yes, I remember.
And when I woke up in the morning, it had some like 5,000 retweets, and and it was an image from a protest, and people were using it as artwork on a poster. And while it was all flattering and overwhelming, but there's also massive change of context when it leaves the hand of the creator.
Yeah.
Then there's so at least for the print edition, I'm really careful. We don't unless it's personally verified, checked, and it comes into a system. We have a system of subscription.
Right.
It comes via an agency requested for the local agency. We don't publish anything.
Okay. MaryAnne, does the Washington Post ever consider, like, of course, with news dailies, there are networks of photographers and reporters who are spread all over, but sometimes maybe in a very, very local space, maybe there is nobody, and yet something has happened and people are sharing images via maybe WhatsApp or however with the team, and is that ever considered or taken into consideration?
Well, they're taken into consideration as part of the reporting, but like Paroma, we don't publish from WhatsApp because it's impossible to verify images from WhatsApp. It's impossible because you can't see original metadata. You can't verify an image on WhatsApp.
Sure.
We actually hire lots of photographers that we find via Instagram because they're really talented photographers, but we make sure we vet them. Exactly the same process. We vet them to make sure that they have journalism training and know how to photograph something, but we've been in certain areas where we've hired people from Instagram. And what we end up doing is in news situations where someone's covering on the ground is we have the technological ability to embed tweets. So we can embed a tweet or embed an Instagram post that goes back to the original author and say, this was seen or that was seen, but not to take it out of its context and use it as if it's a journalism image. I would argue that some of the best photojournalism in the world has been citizen journalism because there's a certain element in a spot news picture of just being on the spot, but in fact, I think that my focus as director of photography is to develop these sort of, deeper narratives about things than just spot news pictures. We run spot news pictures all the time. And like Paroma, we have agencies that go and vet and, we subscribe, for instance, to the Associated Press, to the European Press Agency, to Getty Images, to all these different places. So we have our own small team, but then we have all those other teams that are also vetting material. But we've done call outs, and we actually have a call out now that's first person COVID stories. And we ask people to do a horizontal video of themselves and tell their story and send it in. So we do that quite a lot. And then what we do is we interview each one of them, after you've received, to make sure, they're really a nurse and they really live here. And I mean, it's all these things are required. Verification is absolutely required, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, that the truth has never been more important than it is right now.
And could you quickly just maybe share with us, you just mentioned that there is a vetting process even for photographers that you hire outside who are on contract. And could you just quickly tell us what that vetting process includes?
Well, I have to say, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I've never hired a photographer to work in a war zone that I haven't met.
Okay.
I mean, like, I have to meet them. I
Yes.
mean, now you can actually meet them. You can actually have a Skype or a Zoom
Right.
conversation with people, but I need to meet them and talk to them and look them in the eye and get a
Sure.
sense of who they are as a human being and find out what their education background is and why do they want to go to this place. I remember that it was rather surprising to a couple of people that one of our really top reporters, foreign correspondents, was going to the Ukraine, and we had this photographer that had been talking to us in the Ukraine, and I trust this reporter, completely, utterly. And I said, okay, I have this huge favor for you to ask me, to ask you. And he said, okay, fine, what is it? And I said, will you go sit down and have a coffee with this guy and make sure he's okay? Because I haven't met him. And I have no sense of him, and he's been living there for a while, and he's doing really interesting work, but you need to vet him, So it was funny, you can only do so much when somebody's in the middle of a war zone, right? But he went and had coffee with him and stuff, and he came back and he goes, oh, he's totally legit. He was like giving me the whole rundown on, how well educated he was and how he'd studied the situation and how he was working both sides. And but I mean, that's how deeply I'm not going to just say, oh yeah, there's some nice photographer who made a nice picture in this place, let's put him on assignment. No way, because I'm responsible for them.
Of course. And Tanvi, I mean, since you work with a lot of local photographers, as you mentioned, that you don't have such a like a staff setup with photographers. How does this work for you? Like, especially in areas like Kashmir and all, where anyway the internet hardly works, but maybe getting some local sort of information or story can actually happen from the people, maybe also from some other local journalists over there.
Right. You're asking two separate things, so I think I'll separate that. I mean, the Kashmir thing is actually a very, very important thing that happened last year with the revocation of Article 370, and getting images out of Kashmir will go down as, those anecdotes that you keep telling for years on end, because the longest internet shutdown. Now, the revocation happens on 5th of August, and we're all struggling for images. And we can't send our own photographer in at this point because we don't have our own photographer. And I can't get through to any of the local people that I know there, because even if I do get through to them, how are they going to send me their photographs? Because bigger agencies like the New York Times have the money to fly out their photographer every 2 days to Delhi, give their images in a pen drive. But we work with very, very, very limited resources. So, I mean, the beginning of it was really our reporter went in, and how we even got his reporting, let alone the photographs, was that he took photos of his laptop having typed out his story, and somebody was coming to Delhi, so gave us photographs of a laptop from which we got his story and then typed it out. And so in that kind of setting, to get photographs, we just got him to make pictures. So it's like, and he's actually one of our reporters that takes better pictures than the other reporters. So it's like, I'm just going to run this because this is kind of a first look into what's going on over there. And of course, as time started passing, one of the photographers that I work with often, Masrat Zara, this young Kashmiri photojournalist, she actually flew down to Delhi because she had an exhibition happening in New York, and she wanted to reply to an email. This is a young photojournalist wanting to reply to an email for a first international exhibition, and the shutdown happens. So she doesn't know what to do. So 3 weeks into the shutdown, she comes to Delhi and she hands me this hard drive. And that's when we're like, okay, we're 3 weeks into this thing. And I have a few of her pictures and I can show that.
Please do.
But I also wanted to just address the other part of the question, which was sourced footage.
Yes.
We actually when the anti-CAA protests began and the attack on Jamia happened,
Jamia is a university, MaryAnne. Just
yeah,
for you to
Jamia
know.
is a university, and in December, mid-December, 15th of December, there was tear gas shells that were thrown into the university, and students were basically beaten. What actually, and there was a video that went viral about a student being beaten by the police, of people dressed in clothes that looked like they were policemen's clothes. What was interesting for us is the boy being beaten was in a story that we just did 2 days before. So we recognized him. And it's like, this is Shaheen Abdullah. This is the kid who we interviewed for a story on what happened during the violence. And because we tapped into the university network, and you actually realize how resourceful students are, because the mass communication students and the photography students had been documenting the whole event. So we got into that network, and I have to give this to our multimedia producers and the team. They went in and they actually contacted Shaheen, the kid who was getting beaten up. And through him, we actually managed to source the footage that went viral. And so we ran a video piece, and by sourcing, we got in touch with the journalist he was a young journalist, had just turned freelance, graduated from Jamia. He happened to be at the scene. He recorded this footage, which had basically the whole internet in India had seen it by then, but it was important for us to have it in our video to extend the narrative. So we bought the footage from him. And if you like, I can show a minute of that. So I'll just show a minute of this. I'll skip the Kashmir stuff. And I'm sure there are many in the audience that have seen this video, but it's actually what comes after that was actually important.
I showed them both my ID cards. Like, I have a student ID with me at the time, and a press card with me, my organization's press card with me. And I told them I'm a part of the press, and don't attack me. They were blatantly ignoring my claims, and they started to beat me. They started to tap their lathi on my legs, and for each step they started to beat me.
And the police was brutally attacking everyone without considering it as to be a student, woman, man, old man, or nothing. I think they wanted to make it a perspective of communal thing. Since the protest was not moving on that violent thing, they consciously, intentionally made it to be a violent thing.
That was actually something that we got from source footage, and also, images like this came from a student like Shrikant Sivdas, and he's a student from Jamia University. And
right.
At the end of the day, making the effort to source these photographs, we saw how connected to him, and they are the journalists at this point, the journalists in training, but they were really point. So yeah, we've actually used.
Okay. So I'm just going to quickly maybe take a few more questions. Something connected to this, as travel for journalists gets restricted. This is from Shweta Desai. The earlier question was actually from Gayatri Nair. As travel for journalists gets restricted due to disruption of public transport services and movement restrictions, migrant laborers are turning into reporters to document and narrate their tales of struggles under the lockdown. Do you see this as a new form of crisis reporting? Tanvi, maybe you can go for that.
Migrant laborers turning into journalists. I mean, I am all for giving a camera in the hands of anybody who's closest to the story. And I have to admit, there was a point in my own career where I had to let go of the photographer's images. But I think at Caravan, I think it has come out of necessity, because in some situations it's because of budgets. But in the political situations, like MaryAnne has been, showing us some images of covering the White House and Capitol Hill. Here, access to politicians is very different. And when it comes to a Caravan story, usually politicians do not want to speak to us, let alone give us a portrait. And so I think knowing the history of the Caravan and the critical coverage that has happened over time. So so I think I had to get used to just making do with what's available, because I'd rather have a photograph with a story than not. So I haven't yet come across sort of footage from migrant laborers themselves, but yeah, we're very willing to look at images, but having to shed your own notions of aesthetics and you know, those preoccupations that we may have.
Right. And Raghu Rai is with us, and sorry, yes, Paroma, go ahead.
No, sorry, let's take his question.
No, his question is basically, when would be a good time to start pitching non-COVID photo essays?
I think now. I think that there's a real, I feel like every day in our news meetings post-pandemic, there's the first part of the meeting is, okay, let's talk about virus coverage. And then we talk about all of the virus coverage and they say, okay, now let's pivot and talk about non-virus coverage, because we have to have non-virus coverage as well. We're still doing, you know, parenting columns and health columns and real estate and, you know, all the different things, like what are the effects. And some of it, there is definitely a shadow of the pandemic on top of it, you know, be it the coronavirus or COVID-19, however you prefer to refer to it. But we've also been looking at things that we could do that were not that. Like, so for instance, I'll give you two examples. One is we did a series, like, just to give people some moment of relief. We did a series that of little kids' birthday parties, where people would drive by the homes of a child's birthday because they can't see their friends, they can't see anybody, and they're waving and honking, and you end up having this cute little essay about how to celebrate a child's birthday during coronavirus. Another is that a staff photographer lives in a very specific neighborhood, just like any other place. There's a very specific, he lives in East Springfield, Virginia. And he spent, you know, 2 weeks in his own neighborhood doing, you know, a couple of parents who dressed up like dinosaurs every day and walked down the street to make the children's laugh, you know, on the same time every day. And how at the same time every day, people would come out and bang pots to thank the healthcare workers who are taking care of the people, but just to do like daily life, you know, even during pandemic, there's daily life, you know, so it might have a shadow from the pandemic, but it also can be about daily life. We've, on the flip side of that, have done really gut-wrenching stories about people who've lost their job, lost their home, lost everything, and they don't want to go in a homeless shelter, and they're literally out on the street. You know, because people who were hanging by a thread, the thread is now gone. And they can't survive in this environment. So there's been a lot of help has been, and attention has been brought to a lot of different people, but there are many, many, many people in this country who are suffering dramatically, with 27 million people unemployed.
Right. Paroma, were you saying something earlier? And
I think I was going to say, I mean, about migrant laborers, workers turning reporters. I think there are already a fair amount of outfits in India, actually, who work with training people on the ground for citizen journalism. There's Khabar Lahariya, there's Gaon Connection, a lot of NGOs work, a lot of photographers I know also, you know, sort of work in villages and train. So I think it's not an unheard of sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, as long as it's verified and it's from the ground, better, you know, it's as close as you are to what's happening on the ground is as, you know, as journalism should be, whether it's the written word or the visual image. So I think it's already happening. And sorry, even the People's Archive of Rural India, they're doing some spectacular stories.
I was just about to mention that, yes. So MaryAnne, I'm just going to ask one last question with all three of you, and maybe, I don't know, if you don't have more time, then if Paroma and Tanvi can continue, then I'll just continue, and maybe if you want to you know, leave us, then I will understand. But just one question that was also part of what I had wanted to ask is, especially during crisis, how are photographers being trained in terms of ethics on the ground? Because everything is happening together. There is so much of time is crucial. You have to get the news out as well. And what kind of impact does the photograph have on the subject? It could be a lifelong impact as well. Like, for example, Cnic photograph of, the Napalm Girl, which won a Pulitzer, as well as Kevin Carter's photograph of the struggling girl with the vulture in Sudan, again a Pulitzer-winning picture. And in an Indian context, we have Kutubuddin Ansari, this man whose face kind of became the picture of the Gujarat pogrom, with his hands folded and crying. And later on, their lives are like hounded by that one picture, and so what are the ethics and the privacy, concerns that happen in such a scenario?
Well, I think there are two different questions there. So unpacking the two different questions, the first half is, people should have formal training. And even our staff photojournalists, we provide further formal training. I mean, we have conflict crisis reporting training. They go and do the full, anybody who's covering for us has to have had battlefield, medical training to be able to tourniquet a leg or tourniquet their own leg, or figure out how to operate in a hostile environment. I mean, we have hostile environment training that all of our staff photographers go through, but for anybody who's working in a war zone, I'll just say that they have to have gone through hostile environment training to be on assignment for us, because it's like an insurance policy that at least they know how to take care of themselves. Now, during this pandemic, I would also mention that we've provided gloves and masks and hand sanitizer and instructions about social distancing, about all these different things, but we're very well aware that this is a very insidious virus, and that there's a high level of risk of people becoming infected, even when they're very careful. So that's the one part, the ethics, etc. I think I mentioned earlier in our conversation that I'm on the board of the Eddie Adams workshop, and Eddie Adams took the photo of the South Korean colonel assassinating a known spy, and it ruined that man's life. I mean, I heard Eddie talk about it for years. I mean, he stayed in touch with the colonel, and these situations of things happening like that. It's I think it's there's not a privacy issue to me at all, because the issue is that it's news happening in front of you. Right. And so you're documenting a reality that's happening in front of you. I think that I've been personally in a lot of situations where a photographer and a subject have talked about the impact on each. Cnic, I've met the Napalm Girl at the Eddie Adams workshop and talked to Cnic about, I mean, they're lifelong friends now. Yes. But I've met her, we've had dinner together, I mean, it's like interesting to hear these perspectives firsthand. And I realize that I'm like incredibly blessed with the associations that I've had to be in all these different circumstances. But, the truth is that those moments in time aren't changed by the photograph. It's a document of a circumstance. It's a crisis that's happening, that's photographed. I think if it's in public places, I think it's entirely different if you're in somebody's home, or if somebody doesn't know you're photographing them, or if they're in terrible sorrow. it's been my experience dealing with a lot of very famous photojournalists over the years that they talk about how people want their story told. Even if they're sobbing and they're in grief, they want people to see the pain and the suffering that the circumstance is causing for them. Like when the photographer comes up to get their name and their age and the things they knew, why are you crying? You know, the information they need for their captions, you know, how did you know the man who died? You know, all those kinds of questions that you ask are what give context to those circumstances. And that's like what separates journalism from non-journalism. You know, it's like, oh, I don't know who it is, I just saw him on a street. That's not journalism. You know, that's
Right.
just taking a picture of somebody. You know, I think that's the divide there, is between what you can do professionally. I mean, we've talked about citizen journalism, we've talked about a lot of things.
Yes,
There's a lot of
yes.
citizen journalism that's completely legitimate. You're on the spot, you take pictures. I'll never forget when the subway bombings happened in London. And it was the first time ever that every major news magazine, everybody was publishing pictures taken by passengers from their cell phones. And that's 15 years ago. I mean,
Yes.
these are facts. If you're on the spot and you can legitimately, you can make sure that the pictures are accurate and that they're truthful, people are going to publish citizen journalism. But I think that's one set of photography. And then the completely opposite end of the spectrum is the thoughtful, trained, ethical, professional journalist who's trying to like tell a story from beginning, middle to end, not just here's the news, spot news photo on the spot.
Right. Thank you. Paroma, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so we've, I mean, at least since the time I've been on board now, which has been sort of 2.5 years, and vis-a-vis the pandemic and even the riots, it's been very clear communication, discussions with the editor-in-chief. My boss was a creative director, we have a local Delhi photo editor, all the photographers and the Bombay photographers and all the centers, basically, especially in the migrant workers crisis, since now that they've been, to avoid certain angles, like very top angles, because these have implications on the way photographs are presented. Also in India, there's a huge, barrier of class, of caste, of, so many of the migrant workers are Adivasis. We still don't know the demographic entirely. So it's been a very sort of careful effort to make sure that even when they're in the shelters, which are still in the public domain, not to photograph them up close when they're sleeping or in compromising positions. If it's a very distant shot, just, so small things like respecting privacy, even when they're working and, just because they're poor or they're of a different class and we have the agency to photograph them, does not mean we photograph them the way we think is an accepted way of looking, which is also primarily sort of, white or European way of looking at India. A lot of what you see in the wire agencies. So we're trying so that's happening. And for the safety bit, we've given our photographers protective suits and gloves and sanitizers and extended insurance policies. And so trying to do as much as possible. And of course, I mean, as MaryAnne said, this is a disease that you can't really, you can't set things in place and be sure that it will not hit you, so that, but yeah, so these protocols are in place, and these are in place for like all kinds of assignments. I'll give you an example of that that young guy whose name was being said to be Ram Gopal, who was a shooter at Jamia at one of the protests, and I remember when the photo first came out and Reuters published it. It was a crazy photo of this guy just with a gun looking at somebody shooting, and he turned out to be under 18. Now that there's a legal implication there. So when we published it the next day, we didn't carry the face. Most other publications blurred out, but online his face was still available. Now the thing is, you can see that's an identifier. And initially people thought that those mark sheets are fake and he's not 18, he's 20. But then it turned out that he was indeed 18. Under 18, he was 17 or something. And same thing with the guy who was beaten up in the riots. Again, later out in a story, he said that he actually didn't want to be a subject in that image that became the image of the riots because it left him with so much trauma. So I think photo editors have a lot of responsibility in the afterlife of images also. You know, on
Yes.
the spot is a different thing, but then you can take a call to not run that image again, or relicense it, or, you know, offer it for subscription if the victim has visibly come up, or if you can see that this is triggering trauma.
Okay. Tanvi, you want to say something on this?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of to talk about the ethics and representation angle. I think you're always at this choice of whether you're violating, I mean, whether showing this image and the impact that this image will make of being seen by the public, like what is the cost and benefit in that situation. And sometimes the benefit of the public seeing something that is actually quite violent, and of course there is extreme amount of restraint that is exercised in graphic images, etc. But you know, violence is of all kinds, and when you really start looking
Yes.
at the images, there's, you know, in terms of like, there are all kinds of violence. So the kind of cost benefit analysis you always do in your head, like what is the benefit of putting this news out to the public? And I think in the Kashmir example, this was very, very critical for us, because there was a very concerted effort to not just quell the news or the truth as such from what was happening in Kashmir from reaching the public by the mainstream media in India. Not only were they trying to like shut out that news, they were actually subverting it with another narrative of standing in one stretch in Srinagar and sort of filming there and saying, oh look, traffic is perfectly fine, and you know, there's no curfew and people are fine, and people in Kashmir were really resentful of that coverage. And so when we got images, when images sort of started sort of seeping in, because journalists always find a way to get you their photographs, you're looking at these images, and one of them was actually very, very, it was quite a graphic image, and I've stayed away from using graphic images for a large part of my time at the Caravan. But that image was what the mainstream media and so the state did not want to be seen. It was a boy's face riddled with pellets. And I think that is the choice that you make. This is the truth. This boy was a protester. He wanted his voice to be heard. And to show him in an injured position, it might be slightly disturbing to look at it, but actually, once you look at that image, you see what the state is doing. And this is actually the situation in Kashmir. So you kind of like take it on a case-by-case basis. And with the riots image that Paroma is talking about, there's definitely a lot of debate that was going on in our newsroom. And actually, we did a story where a reporter went back to Zubair, and the story was actually about the photograph. And through the photograph, we traced what happened with him. And what he had actually said in another newspaper, in Express, was it really pained him to see that image. However, he did not voice take away the consent from that image being published, because he also recognized that somewhere, you know, if put in the context that he felt was correct, he wanted his story to go out, because he also developed a relationship with the photographer, which is going back to what MaryAnne was saying, that, you know, there are lifelong relationships that develop. And you know, our reporter spoke to the photographer and spoke to Zubair, and that relationship that developed between them and Danish visiting him even after, and, you know, sort of this continuing dialogue that happened between them, that's actually quite powerful. And incidentally, I mean, the opener for our story was not the violent image, but actually an old family photograph that we got from him, where he's just looking like just another regular guy. And that's what you see, like, you know, you see a regular guy that's beaten up by a whole bunch of people, and that's the state that we're in, because he's wearing a skull cap. So,
right. So we do have a few more questions, but I think MaryAnne,
I have to go.
You have to go now. I can see that. Okay, but thank you so much for being with us. Paroma and Tanvi, are you okay to continue for another 5 minutes, or shall we wrap this up? Yeah, okay.
Can I just thank you very much?
So, MaryAnne, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
It was great to see some of the work and have some insights, I guess. Maybe if somebody has some specific questions for you, I might forward you those on email. But thank you for taking out the time.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. It's very nice to meet my my colleagues in India.
Thank you.
Take good care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. So Yeah, thanks, Paroma and Tanvi. I know it's late, but I'll just maybe take another 5 minutes. I've tried to club some of the questions. Another thing that I wanted to ask is that as an organization, as a publication, is there a focus on training female photographers, and encouraging them to go out and do stories? I kind of remember, Tanvi, that you had recently done a workshop, and I think it was an all-female workshop that you had done. And I just want to know, are organizations also focusing on this gender gap that is there in photojournalism especially? Of course, there are concerns, but I mean, it's not something that women can't do, and I just want to hear your thoughts, because you belong to very different publications, so maybe you can share.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure this goes for Paroma as well. Like, being a woman, you want to see more women out there.
For sure.
For me, the concerns that, concerns is always in quotes, because it's like, whatever a man can do, a woman can do, and sometimes can do it better. You definitely want more women to be out there. I did conduct a workshop, but that was not an institutional workshop. That was something that I did independently with Kashmiri, young Kashmiri photojournalists.
Right.
But through that workshop, I actually got to know them, and I make it a point. I always have a choice. It's like, in Kashmir, who do I hire? And it comes to the fact that they're women, but also coupled with the fact that they're very skilled, and coupled with the fact that I know them, so I know what their sort of gaze is like, what their ethical sort of, where their moral compass is, where their ethical compass is in terms of making images, and that really matters. And like, we get very few opportunities to commission, so you want to believe in the people that do that. That being said, I have to say that I commission fewer women than men, and this is something that I'm always like trying to catch up with. And I catch myself. There was once I was commissioning a story to Sana Irshad Mattu in Kashmir, and it was S.A.R. Gilani's funeral, and the body was being taken to Srinagar, and I was like, okay, we have to have somebody to document this. And they made sure that the body would reach there only at 7:30 in the evening, so that it gets really late and not enough people would attend the funeral. So I called Sana to go to Baramulla, but it was already 8 p.m. and this was during the time of, this is post 370, so there's a curfew, and it's Kashmir, so not just for women, it's just like can be quite unsafe for any journalist out there on their own. So I remember sort of thinking that, okay, this funeral is starting at 8, it's going to finish around 10 or 11, how is she going to get back? And then in my head, I'm like, am I thinking this because she's a woman? Like, would I think the same way if there was a man on the field? Like, maybe I would have concerns with this journalist. But I immediately caught myself and I was like, she will figure this out. And the best thing was that actually, because she was a woman, Gilani's mother took her in and said that, why don't you come and stay with us? So she stayed with all the women. And in the morning, she got photographs of his mother praying and, the women in the compound. So yeah, you realize actually the advantages of having a particular gender in there, and I catch myself kind of being concerned, and then you like slap yourself and saying like, stop it, you can't think of them as definitely just because you don't want that done to yourself.
Paroma.
So I mean, absolutely agree with Tanvi. I mean, the more women there are, the better it is. I also find that women, I mean, I don't know, intrinsically are more sensitive to issues, more patient with listening to all sides of the argument, for looking, I don't know, that's maybe it's in my experience, but that's what I've always found. And I mean, whenever there are vacancies or anything opens up, my first preference is to interview women, and which at least on the photo desk, because the photography team itself is already full. And we did have, Anushi was with us before she went to Reuters, and she did some fantastic stories, around gender when she was at HD, and when we were still sending out photographers out to do stories much more. Now, of course,
Right.
budgets and all that.
But at least there's a conscious effort at
Oh,
having more women.
Absolutely. There's,
Right.
in fact, and I personally put it out whenever I know there are, we might have vacancies. I put out separate personal calls saying women apply more in my college groups, or, even getting with photographers. And on the photo desk, there are more women than men.
Right.
There are 3 women, and it's not just women. I'd like to, at least when I'm putting out the call myself,
Right.
women, people, I'm open to having trans women, identifying as women, queer men, basically the whole gamut, because I just think the more diversity, the better it is. And also for us to learn, it's not like, oh, you're in a position and you stop learning, and that's the death of anybody who's trying to, just build their visual vocabulary. And the more perspectives you have, the better you get, and what you do, the better human being you become. And I think it's imperative that there be more women. But a lot of women, in my opinion, now are actually choosing to be freelancers rather than staffers. So I've actually, last time I had a real problem hiring because I just couldn't find anybody they wanted to freelance, which is great also, because then you have the freedom to do it across publications. So.
Right. And just quickly, one last thing. During now times like these, where of course travel is restricted, and of course teams are sending out photographers and all. But is this the time when freelance photographers from various pockets of the country and from the world can be considered, more to do stories from their localities for publications? And is that something that you as photo editors, you guys would prefer or not?
Yeah, sure. We work with a lot of stringers, even outside the HD staff. We have about 200 stringers working for Hindustan Hindi, all across the country. And sometimes when required, I tap into that network, because something's happening in some remote village, only a local networking. And I personally have always believed that it is the regional, I don't like using the term vernacular, but it's the regional journalists and photographers who are the spine of, the English sort of dailies and national dailies and all that. We're nothing without them, because that's the backbone of journalism in this country. That's from where you get all your sources. So we always, in fact, we work with a lot of freelancers and stringers, and particularly at a time like this, I think it's even harder for freelancers to make any money. And I think one should be, completely giving them as much as income as possible, given the story is relevant and it's usable. And of course, the safety standards are in place, and you don't want to jeopardize somebody, just because you have a certain vision of getting something done. But absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Tanvi, any comments?
We only work with freelancers, so
right.
Yeah, we would be more than happy. But we also know that given COVID, what Paroma just said, that security concerns are always there. So I think here, sort of sometimes, actually experience comes in here quite a bit in terms of like how suited they are, because we know that we're not being able to provide them with security suits and really with any kind of security. We have a protocol, but we cannot go anywhere beyond that. So then it really comes upon to like the relationship of trust between the photographer and the editor, and that again, you also rely on like how much experience does the photographer have. And that is maybe that I really like to give a chance to people just entering the field, but this is a space where you don't want to experiment with somebody who's just a novice just entering into journalism. As much as you want to support them, this may not be the same time, because it might do more harm than good.
Right. Great. I think on that note, I've taken up a lot of your time, and even our audience has been with us for a while now. Thank you so much. I know that these are difficult times, but these are also the times, tougher times are when tougher stories need to go out. And I think in that sense, and on that note, Thank you so much for sharing all your insights and for connecting with our audience. I would also like to take a moment to thank my colleagues Nisha and Priya, who've diligently been working with me to reach our audiences to be part of this discussion today. Thank you everyone so much. I hope this was informative for all our attendees, and there will be, of course, a YouTube video that we will share later. Yes, stay safe, and I look forward to collaborating with all of you again. Thank you.